I thought it would be great just to begin with a little intro and a brief reading, maybe, if you'll just give us a little.
Sure, sure. So this is from the opening of the book. It's the very first chapter from the very first narrator, and her name is Coralie. My brother Buddy's blood stained the pavement of Main Street for weeks after he was murdered. In the drought of 1926, nobody was going to use what water they did have to clean up a sidewalk, so I passed that spot on my way to the Church of Divine Holiness to worship, or Merle's Grocery to pick up cornmeal, or Harvey's Hardware to buy a hinge I needed for Mama's cupboard since Buddy wasn't around to fix it anymore. That stain turned from bright red to dark brown, then faded to a dirty gray until the edges began to flake away in the hot July breeze. I could have walked another way, I know. I could have turned down Oak Street or Linden Lane and cut over. But I just couldn't stop walking past that spot every chance I got, and I was really sorry when it finally washed away in the rainstorm all the farmers had been praying for, because I was sure it was the last of my brother I'd ever see. Turns out I was wrong. A month later, I woke up to a moon so full I thought it was early morning, and when I lifted the curtain, I could see Buddy in the yard looking up at me. Buddy, I called out, oh, Buddy, it's really you. But the next thing I knew, my sister Shelby was on top of me, shaking me to keep quiet or I'd wake Mama. Buddy's out there, I said. Sure he is, along with Daddy, I know, Shelby said. Now quit talking nonsense and go back to sleep. You're just seeing things again, that's all. So I laid down and waited, but by the time her breathing evened out and I pushed back the curtain, Buddy was gone. Truth is, I always could see things. Not every little thing all the time, but the full flower inside the bud of a rose, the fire inside a new green leaf that wouldn't show until fall, the old man inside the boy selling newspapers on the street. Sometimes I even knew the future. One summer when a hard frost killed the crops and everybody was hungry, I had a vision of Johnny Wilcox bringing us a wheelbarrow full of turnips, and sure enough, he showed up the next day. Another time, I saw Laverne Bishop take up a snake, even though she'd never trusted the Lord enough to test her faith before, and the very next Sunday she did. Those times, Mama called me her little prophet. Most of the time, she said it was Satan working through me.
I love that intro. And, you know, when I read it, I was just struck by so many different things. It's beautifully written, but it's also one of those, as a teacher of creative writing workshops, I sort of lit up. Here is one of those perfect examples of so much being woven into the fabric of what's coming. There's such a promise laid out. We know where we are, we know when it is, we know what is going to haunt this novel from beginning to end. And we even get that little bit of humor that is in there, you know, even with the very serious vein of all that's going on in this novel, the wit of Southern speech, loud and clear all the way through. So there are just so many things I want to touch on. So I'll just start by saying to those who have not read this wonderful novel, you know, you just heard we're in the 1920s and then the 40s in rural Arkansas. So there's that strong sense of place and the fact that you're taking us back in time. You do male characters beautifully.
Thank you.
And there are several, and I think that's often difficult to do.
Yes.
And you also just handle mystery so well, in a way that's not teasing, but there's so much mystery on the page, between who knows what. So I'm curious, just I'll just begin with, you know, the time and place, and what drew you in to this particular time and place, because I would think you had to do a little homework.
Not as much as you would think. I had a grandmother who talked a lot about growing up in actually, she did not grow up in Greene County. She grew up right across the border in Missouri in the Bootheel. But the reason that I chose to set the novel in Arkansas was because I feel like the Bootheel of Missouri is so rural. And my father was just a few miles from the border of Arkansas. And actually the piece of Missouri that he's in is surrounded by Arkansas. So so it was more Arkansas than it was Missouri. And I think when you say Missouri, people think Kansas City or St. Louis. When you say Arkansas, people really do understand that it's rural. And so I spent so much time in Arkansas because we had family, who lived there. And the closest, like the big city was Paragould, Arkansas, which is in Greene County. And so, which is not the big city at all. But it was for us when we were visiting my grandparents and later my grandmother. And so, but she talked a lot about things that had happened to her, and she'd had, Coralie is very strongly based on her experience. And her brother was murdered by a sheriff. And she talked a lot about that. And it is actually listed on some of the research I did years ago. I happened to be out one night in Iowa City, and I ended up sitting at a table with a guy from the history department who we got talking about Missouri. He said he was from Missouri. And I said, oh, I've been trying to get information about, my grandmother's records from the state hospital that she was in. And he said, oh, my grandfather was in number 2. Like, which hospital was your grandmother in? I was like, number 4. He's like, here's how you get the records. And listed on her admission form, it says, exciting cause of illness, death of brother. So I had a lot of information going into this, just from my family, from my father and my mother, because my parents actually lived in Arkansas when my dad was in graduate school. And so my mother spent a lot of time around my father's family and absorbed all these stories. So I grew up, kind of marinating in all of this family history, and finally was able to do something with it, which I'm excited about.
Oh, it's fascinating. I mean, and just, looking into mental illness, or what is perceived as mental illness at that particular time, is fascinating in and of itself. But then there's so many twists and turns, and I don't want to do any spoilers here. But as a writer, I have to ask, I mean, clearly you're coming in with the real story of the death of your great uncle. But sort of tell me a little bit about how the whole novel came to be, because you really get into all these different points of view, and it's not limited to the grown-up world at all. You have these younger characters, and even though you're not in the point of view, they're so clearly drawn on the page. And there's just a lot about parental relationships, I think, and parent-child. Sorry, that question was all over the place.
Well, I think one of the things that I was trying to do in kind of getting into, because there are the stories that I had that sort of formed the foundation for the story, and then I had to figure the rest of it out and had to sort of occupy these people. My grandfather died when I was very young, and he's the basis for Big Earl, and I have really nice memories of him, but not a lot of them. I mostly relied on my mother, who talks more about my grandfather, actually my father does, because if my father talks about him, he starts crying and has to leave the room. So my mother has told me all these wonderful stories about what a really kind, straightforward, clear-sighted guy he was. And, it wasn't that he didn't get angry. The scene that he actually, I don't want to say too much, but the scene where he turns up on Leroy's doorstep, kind of out of the blue, to Leroy, actually did happen, and my father witnessed it, and he was in my grandfather's truck with him. So those, trying to kind of figure out, okay, take these things I know about my grandfather and then try and occupy that personality at that time in history, where in that part of the country where a lot of business was transacted using guns, and figure out what would drive someone who's this level-headed and kind, as a basically kind person, to that length, to go to that length to make his point. So a lot of it was just trying to figure out, based on the things that I knew, how would this character react or behave. With the children, a lot of the things that I wrote about Little Earl, who's based on my father, were just trying to figure out, from things that he had told me, how might this have been for him as a child, and growing up with this kind of chaos and this kind of fear. I'm unclear, because there are just some areas that I don't ask about. I sort of know not to go there, but what would that have been like, and how much might he have known about what was going on, and what my grandfather was trying to do, and why he had to sleep at the cotton gin all the time, and how he might process that as a child, because children, I think, don't know any different than what they're raised with. And so kind of trying to figure out how he would engage with what was happening around him or not, and then of course deal with the fallout of being known as someone who had a mentally ill mother, and what I know that was like. So that was the way into Little Earl's character. And I don't know how to talk about Caleb without giving away too much, so I won't.
I was just gonna say, it's that's such a rich part of the storyline, and we'll have to invite readers to, trust me, you will, you'll be glad we made you wait. But that is a wonderful friendship, and I love Big Earl. I just love him, and that's what I mean. He's so endearing in so many ways. His understanding, and yet multi-dimensional.
Yeah.
He's a real guy and a really good father. I think for me, some of the most harrowing scenes related to the community response to her are those scenes where she's being chased by young boys. So
Yes.
you can only imagine what Little Earl is getting at school.
Yeah.
But it's pretty terrifying, and that strand of that kind of terror and being pursued and not knowing who to trust when. There's a lot of betrayal on the page.
Yes.
And so I'm curious, and it weaves into the whole community religion scene and the snake handling. And were those stories also stories that came to you, or?
No, yes, they were. That was my grandmother's church, and essentially the way in which they used her faith to defend her because she was contributing so much to the church and managed to change Leroy's mind in the story, are true. And so, I mean, you can see how much of this was actually just landed in my lap. I'm like, how can I not tell this story? But I also went to my grandmother's church with her when I was a girl. My father, I think, made sure we went on days where they were not snake handling. But my sister and I would go and witness the speaking in tongues and the holy rolling. And, you know, there was a lot going on. There were healings. This was all very different from, you know, the churches that I was raised in, because I was raised in, we kept moving churches because my father was never comfortable in church because of his upbringing. And my mother really wanted us to have a background in religion. And so there was this push and pull in my family, but it really was, I was probably, I don't know, 9 maybe when my father sent me to church with my grandmother for the first time. And after that, I was pretty young, but I really did understand why he didn't want to go. You know, it was pretty intense compared to what I was used to, you know?
Yeah, no, it's terrifying to read. But you also, from the very beginning, you know, you put us in this position where she's questioning, you know, is it real? Is it, you know, her sanity? I mean, she's questioning everything, but also so haunted by the death of her brother and so wanting to connect. You understand her desperation and whatever she might attempt along the way. Yeah, Leroy is another very powerful character on the page.
He's the only character, his storyline is entirely invented. The only thing that's true is that my grandfather did turn up on his doorstep that day. That was the only thing that I knew. And I have the newspaper article about my great uncle's murder. And that's just something that was in my family, and my father knew that I was interested in it, so he gave me a copy of it. But I decided that was one of the sort of narrative decisions that I made, was to make Leroy the lawyer who later becomes the judge, and then tie these two legal cases in my family together using this one person. So, and there was a lot of informality in this part of the country at the time, in terms of, like, you know, there might have been, you would think that there might have been a conflict of interest here, but it really was not. It was just not the kind of place. It was so small and so isolated that things were handled in a very loose and maybe not what we would necessarily consider legal way. My father has a classmate who wrote an autobiographical account of growing up in this town, and it's called Horizons. And he talks about in this book, he talks about a case in the town that my father grew up in, where one of the family members of one family killed a family member, you know, in another family, and then someone from that family killed someone in the other family. And when the cops showed up, all they said was, "Are we good? Like, no more killing, no more killing." Okay, and off they went, and that was it. I mean, there wasn't, you would think people would be going to jail, there would be all kinds of investigation. Things were handled in a very what we would think of as a really kind of shoot from the hip kind of way, but vigilante justice, yeah. An eye for an eye, and the police figured it was between the families, and they just let them, if it was dealt with and they promised they weren't going to do any more of it, then that was it. And that would have been in the 50s. So, you know, I mean, it's really, really isolated. The pictures that I have, I did this presentation recently of pictures of the town, and people here in Boston just like cannot believe, you know, like what the police department looks like. It's a pole barn with a hand painted sign that says, Cardwell Police Department. So that was tricky, because I was thinking, like, is a lawyer going to read this and be like, this would never happen? And but in this particular place, it would have happened. There were just so many things that were overlooked, or, allowed to kind of let slide. And people on the take, all kinds of things going on. So I had to kind of figure out a way to kind of explain how Leroy becomes the judge and takes on this case despite his role in a previous case.
No, it works, as murder mystery, legal thriller. But it's so much more than that. That may be the plot line carrying us along, but the novel is just so rich in detail of the place and the time and these family relationships and the importance of all those relationships. Yeah. And again, we can't talk too much. And I realized when I was looking through, thinking about things that you could read, it's also so intricately entwined, and so
I have to be careful what I read. It gives too much away.
Yeah. I'm sure you do, because our opinions of certain characters change, and but there are just so many images that are so vivid. I don't think I'll ever forget what you read, and not only is it the blood on the sidewalk, but it's left there because of the drought, and there not being enough water. Yeah. I mean, when I see a detail like that, I really feel I'm not just in a place, but completely total immersion, if we're talking immersion here, in just in the customs of a very particular place. And you almost feel like you entered the city limits and the door closes behind you in the book. And I say that as a great compliment. And again,
thank you.
I'm going to show, I love your jacket.
Oh my gosh. Laura Williams was the designer for that. And I just couldn't believe it. Pretty early on, I saw a early version of this, and I was just like, this is so beautiful. And of course, with book jackets, you never know what they're going to look like. And so this was just, I was like, this is really, just amazingly lucky, and how gorgeous. I was thrilled.
It's gorgeous. Well, I mean, Blair, hats off.
Yes.
they do beautiful work.
Yeah, they have been just a dream to work with.
Yes, well, just such a fabulous house. And so I don't, you teach writing, you've written stories.
I have. Yeah.
This novel. What was I'm going to ask one of those really mundane kind of questions, but I'm always curious about the revision process, and sort of you and Blair coming together.
Sure. So I'm not sure you want the answer to this. I'm not sure anybody really wants the answer to this, because the revision process was really hard for me. I can over edit. And very close to the time that my agent submitted this to Blair, she had submitted this to Blair in the middle of the pandemic, or actually right before the pandemic hit. Then the pandemic hit, and she wrote to me and said, we're not going to hear anything. And then she got a message back from Blair saying, we really like this, but we would like Coralie to be the first speaker. Leroy was the first speaker in the original draft. And could you change that? And my first reaction is always, what? How could I, like, how can I change it? Like, how, I don't even know. I would have to rip the whole thing apart. And I sort of did have to rip the whole thing apart in order to do that. So right before I went to submit it to Blair after making the changes that they had, and by the next day, my husband and I were going to Crane Beach that day, and you had to have a reservation because it was the pandemic, or they wouldn't let too many people in. And so we weren't going to give up our beach day, but I took all my stuff with me. And by the next day, I was already like, I think I know how to do this. And I started with what is now the beginning of the book. But right before I went to submit it, I gave it to my husband to read, who has read this. My saintly husband has read this book in 20 different drafts, and he read it and he made a couple of like line edits. And I went back up to my study and I started making the changes, and I could not stop myself from editing. And I began to edit and edit and edit. And pretty soon I had cut 25 pages, and I came downstairs and I was in tears, and I said, I can't stop. And he was like, you did what? And so he helped me get it back to, like, reset it to get it back to where it needed to be. And then he, like, seriously sat on top of me. He would not let me be alone with it. And I made the changes that he had found. And then he would not leave the room until I sent it to Anne to send, my agent, Anne Collette, to send to Blair. And then working with them was just so fantastic. First of all, the feedback they gave me initially was great. But then when they offered me the contract, of course, the editing continues. And Robin Mira, who I think is here tonight, she is the most wonderful person to work with, and just such a gracious and really insightful editor. And it was just such a pleasant process. And I felt like every time we did anything together, the book got better and better. So it was a really wonderful experience for me.
Yes, no, Robin is wonderful. And now I'm trying to think, I mean, I can totally understand your impulse of having started with him. In my most recent novel, I think I started in 3 different, everybody beginning over the course of it all. And it's just, I mean,
and you chose Shelley. You start with Shelley.
I chose Shelley after being with Frank and Lil for years. Like, it was Frank for years, then Lil. And then I found, with editorial help, the place where all the characters were introduced in one place. And that's where your opening with Coralie does that, because you give so much information about what's going to guide us through the whole novel, which is what I found so fascinating, is that kind of opening, like To Kill a Mockingbird, when you go back to the first page and you realize it's all right there, in this little capsule, various references. And I feel like she gave us so much without revealing anything, which is why, I mean, for me, it was just so compelling to get her voice.
Thank you. I would say the same thing about Shelley. I feel like you bring together this great and really common. This is something people in my family do. They actually go knock on the doors of houses where they've lived and ask to see if they can come in. So this is something that I've seen, my parents do in houses where they've lived, and I've actually done it in the house that we lived in until I was until I was like 4 or something. But I went back, 20 years later and asked. And but I love that that's the initial contact between them. It's just this simple request that she does that she's uncomfortable with. And but it's the way that these 2 families intersect is through this shared household. And it's such a just amazing, like, I mean, this is one of the things that I was thinking about when I was reading Hieroglyphics, but I was thinking too, you know, about your other work, and I was thinking also about Life After Life, that you have all of these layers of time that overlap in one place. So like there's the moment where Lil goes to the building where the Coconut Grove once was and sits there in the lobby at the time to try and, you know, like connect to the fire and her mother. And it's like everything is happening at the same time. I actually I have a passage from Hieroglyphics that I want to read because I feel like you actually explain this process in this passage. Do you mind if I just read this?
No.
It's short.
No, thank you.
Lil is doing her wedding write-up, and she says, "And isn't it funny how things get layered, how my memories of your weddings are in part about the way I remember my own, as if I had a foot in two places. I was there adjusting your beautiful veil, Becca, and I was also thinking how I had not had my mother there to adjust mine. Or I watched you drive off with all kinds of things soaked onto the windows of your cars, some not repeatable, written by fraternity brothers of your first husband. And for the life of me, I cannot recall his name, embarrassing but true, starts with an R, I'm fairly sure. Not that I need to recall it, but it's a way I challenge myself to get there. Go through the alphabet, riffle those file drawers of mine, packed to maximum capacity." And I feel like you have this way of just layering the way that people actually think, not like the way that, you know, we clean it up when we're speaking, or the way that we clean it up when we're, you know, like writing a letter or email. It's all of the associations that come together from different times, you know, that are going on, that you have to kind of push aside if you're having a conversation with somebody. But and maybe it's just that I think like you do, but I feel like I've never read a better description of the way that I think than the way that you represent the way that people are constantly falling through time and moving backward as they move forward. And it's just really an incredible feat. And I'm not sure how you do it.
Well, thank you for that. I mean, I think you've spent time in the South, so I think a lot of people in the South do tell stories that way, and they don't filter out all the little asides. My poor dad was like this his entire life, trying to get my mother to speed up because it took so long to get from point A, you know, to point B. There were all these asides, and you know her, and you know her husband, and the meandering story method. Yeah. And we do think that way. And I find the older I get, you know, the more time starts to blend and merge. And I think it happens naturally when you're writing a novel with a lot of different characters who have overlap, because certainly I feel it in this novel, because you get it's always so fascinating to have shared memories from different angles, because we never have the same memories, you know. No one matches up, and it's always so interesting to look for that little piece, you know, that's different or that you didn't know. And I'm sure making your decisions, your creative decisions while working around real family stories, I can only imagine that was a kind of presented probably a difficulty that if you were working from the whole cloth, you wouldn't have faced.
Yeah, there were a lot of moments where I had to really think, okay, is this going to be okay with my family if I use this, or if I tell this story, or if, you know, like I wanted to be sensitive to things that are painful. And at the same time, I wanted to be true to the characters. So that was a constant juggling act as I was, working on this. And one of the things that led to actually was making Coralie. My father said, this was such a nice thing. My father said after he read the book that he felt like he understood his mother better, because his mother was not, which is incredibly, it's such an amazing thing because I was really working off, the visits, the annual visits or, biannual visits that I had with her. And she would call every night at like 5:30. And, so she was a part of our lives in, a pretty regular way. But the long stretches of time that I spent with her were limited to, like twice a year. And so I was constantly thinking, how can I she was a very blunt person, which you get in her dialogue. But I had no access to her to her inner life. And so I had to create this inner life for her that could explain her behavior. And I think my father never had access to that either, but I just was sort of taking these things and thinking, okay, how do I make her relatable? And because I did feel real empathy for her. She was, the scene where she talks about how she doesn't know how to talk to people. And she says she doesn't know when the right time is to say something funny or when it's your turn to talk and that was she was very awkward that way. But I also feel like most people feel like they're awkward that way. I know I certainly do. And so I thought, I think that everybody can relate to moments when they are in a crowd of people and they don't exactly catch on to the rhythm of, the way this works. It was just that was the way it was for her all the time.
And we get that her lack of education.
Yeah.
No, just the way she does talk to her son is so, I'm just sitting here thinking how moving it must have been for your dad to read it, and you could not get a greater compliment.
No, I know. It was seriously blew me away. I was so thrilled because I was worried he would say, no, she never said that, or she wouldn't have done that, but that was not his reaction at all. It was
found
really
myself,
nice.
Yeah, there were always another of my favorite. I marked her passages throughout. Mama always told us the only man a woman could rely on was the Lord. But when the law came calling, turns out you can't even rely on your own mama neither. Over religious, that's what she told that judge. Anyway, her voice is just so clear in my mind. And just her own way of saying things. But a level of truth and passion that's just so powerful. I mean, she is a wonderful character.
Thank you. She was tough to write. I mean, she would have been diagnosed today probably as a paranoid schizophrenic. It's called something else, a very old term for dementia in the records. But I had to figure out how to represent what was a hallucination and what wasn't, because we always had to figure that out on our own. And I ultimately decided that was the way to handle it with the reader too. So you don't really know always if what she's seeing is real or not. And I think I feel like that was the right way to go with her ultimately.
Absolutely. And you plant these other little pockets of the unknown. Another favorite for me is that her mother, she wants to know why her mother was upset with her brother the day he died. And it's this very subtle thread, but you weave it all the way through. And that's the kind of little thing I'm always looking for as a reader, that I just hold on to, because I knew you would keep coming back to it, but I had no idea what you would do with it. And it's just very satisfying. It's I mean, it is such a rich story with all the different threads. And yeah, we're not giving people spoilers, but
I know.
you really need to, because it really is. I mean, it's just this microcosm of everything that goes into a community.
Yeah.
You've
Well, you know that well because your books explore community and community collection connections as well. And you even have connections between your books with characters who appear in later books. You know, I was so thrilled. I don't want to give anything away. I was so thrilled in Hieroglyphics to get the answer
thank you.
to the question raised in Life After Life. That was so exciting.
So many people got mad at me for, not solving things. I thought it was realistic, but
I understood why you did it, but I also was like, hey, wait a minute. I think I know what's going on here. And yeah, that was really exciting.
Thank you for that. I really appreciate it. No, I think for me as a reader, I'm so fascinated by community and the way one life, affects another, sometimes without even knowing, or, that you pass right by where you could have learned the whole story and you don't notice. And your people are just kind of, missing one another. If the movie gets made, we'll have those scenes where they sort of drive in opposite directions.
Well, from your lips to God's ear.
But I'm trying to think, is there something you wanted to talk about that I have not brought up?
I don't think so. I have questions for you. I'm concerned that we're maybe running out of time. But do we have time? Can I ask a question?
Sure. And I think then Stephanie's probably popping in soon. But,
okay. All right. Well, let me ask this question. You write, I'm really fascinated by the way you write third person. I feel like I do this exercise with my students that has to do with psychic distance with third person and how close you can actually get to the inside of a character, or how distant you can stay. And one of the things that's really fascinating to me about your writing is that your third person is so psychically close to the characters that I don't notice sometimes. If you shifted from first person to third person, because I just feel like I'm right inside the character all the time. And that's happened to me several times reading your work. I'll be like, wait a second, this isn't, I'll be halfway through a chapter. I'll be like, wait, this isn't third person. But I don't notice it because the shift is so subtle because of the psychic nearness that you use in third person. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about your decisions to put one character in first person, another character in third person, or characters in both, where in Life After Life, you have Joanna and we get the third person account of Joanna, but we also get her notebook and that's in first person.
Right. No, I often use first person to establish the voice on the page, knowing that I'm going to flip it.
Oh, wow.
I have the voice because, sometimes juggling a lot of characters, that third person does give you the power to sort of zoom out or zoom in, and still get really, really close. So, and it does slip into the voice, and there are times when I have to go look and think, did I write that in first or third? But I always tell my students, there oftentimes is a natural pull to one or the other, and I really believe in paying attention to that. and the more that I have sort of worked on weaving these communities, third has sometimes been easier for me to get into the voice, like especially Frank's voice was very hard for me.
I think one of the great things about
characters who are smarter than you are.
I think one of the great things about third person is that you actually can access things about, like in first person, you have a somewhat unreliable narrator no matter who's speaking because it's just their account. In third person, you can actually show that they're deluding themselves into thinking things, and you know what I mean, in a way that you can't do in first person. And I feel like using both really allows you to get the kind of full picture, both the narrated version of the character, but also what the narrator of the novel knows about and can access through third person.
And it also, at least for me, has felt easier to slip in and out of memory when you have someone in a present place where it might feel more self-conscious if you were narrating that you're sitting there thinking, this or that. Of course, Lil just did it and described, but I think for those longer passages, sometimes I feel like what's happening on the present is about an inch long, and then you go way down and come back.
I know exactly what you mean. It feels with your characters like it's like things are stacked on top of each other, all these things, and you have to really mine very deeply into the characters and take us with you in this really incredible way where I think I said this before, but I feel like the characters have to move back often to move forward, whether that's geographically or through memory, in order to progress.
I love that. We need to teach a class together. I'm really enjoying this conversation, and I hope people who have tuned in that there's some writers out there, because it's fascinating to me, and the way this novel is put together is just beautifully woven. So I'm glad we came to that part of the conversation.
Well, me too. Thank you so much for being here tonight and for reading. You were one of the first readers of my novel. So thank you for that as well.
My pleasure. And Stephanie's here, I think. So we may have some questions.
We do. We do have a couple of audience questions that we'll go ahead. I'll read those out for you. And before we do that, I'll just say thank you as well for the conversation and the mini writing workshop that you've just provided. Thank you. So Mary Beth, this question's for you. And it's phrased in a way, it's designed to avoid spoilers. You'll see what I mean when I get to the so this is from Ellen, who says, it was refreshing to nowadays spend time in the heads of quote unquote good or trying to be good people. And Ellen wonders if you considered writing from the perspective of a bad guy, like quote unquote, you know who.
Sure. My agent really wanted me to write from the perspective of you know who. And I felt for this book, I thought that would be a really great challenge to be able to write from his perspective in a way that allows you to either allow him to just be a villain, or to make him have reasons that we can't understand for the things that he's done that explain, and I think probably for this book, I felt like I thought about what she suggested, and I thought, that would really give away everything if we knew what was going on from his perspective. I couldn't figure out how to get him in there without ruining, because what he knows is the thing that everybody wants to know in the book. And so if he's in there, I think it would have presented a huge challenge to not mention what it is that he knows. So I chose to leave him out, but I did think about it, and my agent did think about it. So thank you, Ellen, for the question.
And
That
such
is
a
a great question.
It is a wonderful question and such a deftly crafted answer, without actually giving, giving anything
It's
away.
really hard to talk about these
So,
things without spoilers, but yes.
Yeah. We have a question from Debbie, who asks, other than the book you just mentioned you were talking about reading a book earlier that informed the work. How did you research the subject matter and the time period? Or did you just find plenty of material through your family stories?
Mostly it was material through my family stories. It was the newspaper article about my great uncle's death. And my grandmother's medical records from the state hospital where she spent 7 years. They were heavily edited. I really wonder what wasn't in there, because for 7 years we got about 4 pages. They're full, but it's just a handful of appointments, and I know she had more than that. So that was frustrating, and I really had to kind of figure out what I wasn't getting. I looked up laws. I looked up legal questions, that I would need to know in terms of writing Leroy. But for the most part, I relied on family stories. I interviewed relatives, and I also just have a kind of a crazy memory, and I remember things I was told when I was very little from people who are long gone. And I'll say, "Oh, do you remember when Aunt Stelly said this?" And my dad will say, "I think you were 6 when that happened. How do you remember this so well?" And I'm like, "Oh, and she was wearing this dress, and she said, and Uncle Sonny Boy was there." and my dad will be like, "This is just, So I guess I'm lucky in that sense, even if sometimes having that kind of a memory feels like a burden. It's a lot of information, but it's there for me to call on. And I did that pretty heavily for the book.
Thank you. And then the last question will be for you, Jill. It's from Judith, who says, Jill, have you ever experienced a character going flat when you switch from first to third person? And Jill says, I've found some characters insist on owning their own I.
Yeah, I oftentimes go back and forth, especially in short stories. I find myself flipping more and seeing what the most natural voice is. So, and I do the same with tense, and I always tell my students that if you look back over your draft, and it keeps slipping in the other direction, you should probably pay attention to it. Or I learned a long time ago to pay attention. But yeah, I've had a lot of times I have that first person character, and I end up once I had a character write a letter in order to get her voice. This was years ago, the first time I did it. And then I ended up just keeping the letter, as part of the novel, because she was working better for me in first person. So I never say never right there.
That's another piece of great advice for writers in the audience. We always get those when we see you. So again, it's been great to listen to the two of you talk about the gods of Greene County and hieroglyphics and writing, and snake handling, and everything that's that's come up this evening. And
this novel really does have something for everyone.
Truly, yes. And so I'll just take that as a cue to once again encourage folks who are watching to pick up a copy of the Gods of Greene County. And yes, let's see that beautiful cover again. Shout out again to Blair.
I was going to say a big shout out to Blair.
Yeah, Blair's a really great nonprofit publisher here in North Carolina.
Absolutely. We're
and
so
they-
proud of them.
Yeah, and they always do a wonderful job. So we encourage you to pick up The Gods of Greene County from us at Malaprops. We appreciate it, but if not us, from your local independent bookstore, wherever you are. And also, of course, Hieroglyphics and Life After Life and other books by Jill McCorkle, which we've linked to also in the chat. So thank you to everyone who's been with us this evening. And thank you so much, Mary Beth and Jill.
Oh, thank you, Stephanie and Malaprops. This has been really great. And Jill, thank you so much.
Oh, congratulations. It's just been a great pleasure to meet face to face.
Yes.
Maybe in person one of these days when we
I
teach
hope
the
so.
workshop. Yeah.
Yeah.
But thank you, Stephanie. And I sure look forward to wandering your aisles in person before long.
We look forward to that too. We look forward to seeing both of you in the
Yes.
store, and anyone out there who like to come in and wander. So thanks everyone again. And again, yes, Mary Beth, congratulations on the book.
Thank you so much.
Yeah,
Thanks
we
again.
look forward to seeing you again. So everyone, please stay safe and well, and we'll hope to see you again soon. Good night.
Thank you.
Good night.